The send button made a pathetic hollow swoosh sound. That was it. The exact audio accompaniment to my life imploding. I meant to attach the Q3 architectural schematics. Instead, I dragged and dropped a highly detailed, color-coded PDF of my biological downfall, my personal medical calendar, and heat schedule. The recipient, Eleanor Vance. The woman who signs my paychecks. An alpha who normally looks at me like I'm a stubborn smudge on her glass desk. The server lagged. The recall failed. Now she knows exactly when I'll break. My apartment smelled like burnt toast and cheap lavender detergent. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Thursday, the kind of hour where the human body stops producing rational thought and just runs on cortisol and spite. I was staring at the glare of my laptop screen until the spreadsheet lines began to vibrate. My eyes burned. A dull, pulsing ache had settled right behind my left temple, a side effect of the heavy-duty suppressants I'd been swallowing like breath mints for the past 5 years. Being an omega in high-end corporate architecture wasn't a death sentence, but it was a logistical nightmare. You didn't broadcast it. You managed it. You filed it away under chronic inconveniences and worked twice as hard to prove you weren't ruled by lunar cycles and pheromones. Eleanor Vance demanded perfection. She was the senior partner, an alpha whose presence took up all the oxygen in a room without her having to raise her voice. She smelled of ozone, like the static charge right before a lightning strike, and something darker, like crushed cedar and rain-soaked earth. I hated the smell. Mostly because my traitorous biology didn't. I rubbed my face, my palms pressing against my tired skin. Just send the damn file, Maya, I muttered to the empty room. My fingers were stiff and clumsy from cold and fatigue. I clicked new email, typed Vance, and the autofill did the rest. Subject line, final revisions, the Hawthorne project. I clicked the attachment icon. My desktop was a graveyard of poorly named files. I saw the PDF titled schedule_final_revised, clicked it, hit attach, and pressed send. Swoosh. I leaned back, a heavy sigh rattling in my chest. Done. I reached for my mug of cold, sludgy coffee, bringing it to my lips. My eyes drifted lazily back to the sent folder, just to verify the upload. My blood stopped moving. The attachment wasn't Hawthorne_schedule_final_revised.pdf. It was IC_medical_schedule_final.pdf. The mug slipped from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into 3 large pieces, cold coffee splattering across my bare feet. I didn't feel it. Cold, nauseating sweat erupted across my scalp. No. I slammed my hands onto the keyboard, lunging for the undo send option. The little yellow banner at the bottom of the screen had already faded. I clicked wildly into the sent email, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it ached. I opened the attachment. There it was. Not blueprints. Not steel load-bearing calculations. It was a calendar. My calendar, annotated by my endocrinologist. It detailed my daily dosage of synthetic inhibitors, my baseline pheromone levels, and circled in a glaring, undeniable red highlighter tool, the projected dates of my next heat cycle. Starting next Tuesday. A 72-hour window where I was legally mandated to stay home, lock my doors, and ride out a feverish, humiliating biological imperative. A window I had meticulously requested PTO for, claiming I was attending a regional design conference in Chicago. I tried the server-side recall. I clicked the button. A little loading wheel spun. It spun for 10 seconds. Then a sterile gray box popped up. Recall failed. The recipient has already opened this message. She was awake. At 2:16 a.m. And she was reading it. I sat in the dark, the blue light of the screen washing over my face. My breathing sounded loud and ragged in the quiet apartment. My scent, usually tightly coiled and masked by a sharp, clinical soap, spiked with sour distress. It smelled like bruised apples and panic. I didn't sleep. I spent the next 4 hours staring at the ceiling, mapping out my resignation letter. I imagined the pity in HR's eyes. I imagined Eleanor Vance, her jaw tight, deleting the email with a swipe of her thumb, disgusted by the sheer unprofessionalism of it. To an alpha of her standing, an omega's unmasked biology wasn't alluring. It was messy. It was a liability. By 6:30 a.m., I was in the shower, scrubbing the cold sweat off my skin until I was red and raw. I popped 2 suppressants instead of 1, dry swallowing them. They tasted like chalk and battery acid. I pulled on my clothes, a tailored blazer, silk blouse, tailored trousers. I put on my armor. I would go in, I would hand in my key card, and I would leave with whatever dignity I had left. The subway ride was an exercise in sensory torture. Rush hour in the city was a crushing wave of damp wool, stale perfume, and the overwhelming, aggressive musk of unbothered betas and alphas. Usually my suppressants muted the world to a dull hum. Today, because of the double dose, I felt strung out, hyper-aware of every shift in the air, every accidental brush of a stranger's shoulder. My skin crawled. I walked into the Reese Associates building at 7:45 a.m. The lobby was a monument to Eleanor's aesthetic, brutalist concrete, sweeping expanses of glass, and absolute clinical silence. It felt like walking into a mausoleum. I swiped my badge. The light turned green. A tiny mercy. She hadn't locked me out of the building yet. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. My desk was in the outer ring, a sleek minimalist setup that guarded the frosted glass doors of Eleanor's corner office. The floor was mostly empty, save for a few overachieving junior architects. I set my bag down. My hands were shaking. I shoved them into my blazer pockets. I looked at Eleanor's door. The lights were on. She was already here. I sat down and booted up my computer. My inbox was empty. No demanding emails. No see me immediately messages. Just nothing. The silence was worse than a reprimand. It was a vacuum, sucking the air right out of my lungs. At 9 a.m., the intercom on my desk buzzed. The sound made me jump, my knee cracking painfully against the underside of the desk. Maya. Eleanor's voice was distorted by the speaker, but the low, resonant contralto still vibrated in the pit of my stomach. In my office. Now. Yes, Ms. Vance. My voice sounded thin. Pathetic. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I walked the 20 feet to her door like a woman walking to the gallows. I knocked twice. Come in. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The immediate change in air pressure made my ears pop. Eleanor kept her office cold, 68 degrees year-round. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was her scent. It saturated the room, that sharp, cracking ozone and deep cedar. It bypassed my conscious brain and tapped directly into a primitive nerve cluster at the base of my spine. My body, despite the synthetic chemicals flooding my bloodstream, recognized an apex predator. Eleanor was sitting behind her desk. She didn't look up immediately. She was wearing a charcoal suit, the crisp white collar of her shirt contrasting with the sharp line of her jaw. She was 42, ruthless, and entirely immovable. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe knot, not a single strand out of place. Her features were angular and striking, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and pale gray eyes that missed nothing. Shut the door, Maya. I closed it. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot. Take a seat. I walked over and sat in the Barcelona chair opposite her. The leather was cold. I kept my back rigid, my knees pressed together, hands folded in my lap. I braced myself. Eleanor finished signing a document, capped her fountain pen, and set it down with meticulous care. Only then did she look at me. Her eyes didn't hold disgust. They didn't hold anger. They were utterly, terrifyingly blank. She reached out and tapped a single sheet of paper resting in the center of her otherwise immaculate desk. I recognized the color coding even upside down. My chest tightened. "I received your email last night," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and even, no inflection. "Ms. Vance," my throat felt like it was filled with sand. I forced myself to swallow. "I apologize. It was a severe lapse in judgment. I was exhausted and I attached the wrong file. I have my resignation letter drafted. I can have my desk cleared by noon." Eleanor watched me. She didn't blink. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The scent of ozone in the room seemed to spike, growing sharper, almost metallic. "Resignation," she repeated, tasting the word like it was a foreign concept. "Yes." She picked up the paper, my medical schedule. "You requested next Tuesday through Thursday off for the Northeast Regional Design Symposium." I looked down at my hands. "Yes." That was a lie to cover my absence. "Your heat." Hearing her say the word out loud in this sterile, professional environment felt obscenely intimate. It felt like she had reached across the desk and put her hand around my throat. A flush crept up my neck, burning my ears. "Yes," I whispered. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. She studied the paper for another long moment. "Your endocrinologist is Dr. Orris. A good woman. Aggressive with her suppressant protocols." Eleanor's eyes flicked up to mine. "Perhaps too aggressive." "You look awful, Maya." I blinked, entirely thrown. "Excuse me. You have dark circles under your eyes. You've lost weight over the last quarter. And right now, you smell like burnt sugar and panic, entirely masked by a heavy dose of synthetic blockers that are currently ravaging your liver." My breath hitched. She could smell through the blockers? That was impossible unless the alpha was intentionally trying to scent me. "I'm managing it," I said defensively, my cynical edge flaring up to protect my exposed nerves. "It won't affect my work. It never has. As I said, I'll resign." "You aren't resigning." Eleanor interrupted, the blankness in her eyes shifting to a dangerous, quiet intensity that flooded into the gray. "You are my best junior architect. You are meticulous, driven, and you understand load-bearing stresses better than anyone in this firm." She dropped the paper back onto the desk. "However," she continued, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, "I do not appreciate being lied to. Nor do I appreciate my employees destroying their bodies to fit into a corporate mold. It's just biology, Ms. Vance. It's an inconvenience." "Is it?" Eleanor stood up. She was tall, 5'11" of lean, dense muscle hidden under bespoke tailoring. She walked around the edge of the desk. My heart rate doubled. I couldn't help it. My instincts were screaming at me to lower my head, to expose the vulnerable line of my neck. I fought it, keeping my chin painfully level. Eleanor stopped beside my chair. She didn't touch me. She just stood there, invading my personal space. The heat radiating off her body was palpable. "You will not go to the symposium next week," Eleanor said softly, looking down at me. "You will take your leave. But you are going to stop taking these heavy-duty blockers immediately. They are killing you." "If I stop taking them," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "my cycle will hit harder. It will be unmanageable." "It will be natural," Eleanor corrected. "And you will manage it. At home." She paused. "And until then, you will report directly to me for everything." I looked up at her, entirely bewildered. "I already report to you." Eleanor leaned down, bracing one hand on the armrest of my chair. She was so close I could see the individual lashes framing her pale eyes. Her scent washed over me, heavy, possessive, intoxicating. My breath caught in my chest. A low, humiliating ache sparked in my lower belly. "You report to me professionally, Maya," Eleanor murmured, her gaze dropping to the collar of my blouse, right where my pulse was jumping frantically against my scent gland. "Starting today, I am taking an active interest in your well-being. Do we understand each other?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded. Good. Eleanor straightened up, the crushing weight of her presence lifting slightly. Go back to your desk. Send me the actual Hawthorne schematics. I practically fled the office. When I sat back down at my desk, my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't type. I felt a dampness on the back of my neck. She didn't fire me. But as I sat there, inhaling the lingering scent of ozone that had clung to my clothes, I realized something infinitely more terrifying. Eleanor Vance had just claimed my calendar. And she was waiting for Tuesday. Over the next 3 days, my reality fractured. I followed Eleanor's orders. I cut my suppressive dosage in half, too terrified of her quiet authority to defy her completely, but too terrified of my own body to quit cold turkey. The withdrawal was brutal. It felt like peeling off a heavy, suffocating wetsuit I'd worn for 5 years. Suddenly, the world was too loud, too bright, and far, far too fragrant. The sterile office environment became a minefield. I could smell the anxious, sour sweat of the interns. I could smell the cheap chemical cologne of the beta project managers. But above all, I could smell Eleanor. Her scent had changed. The sharp, impersonal ozone was still there, but the cedar had deepened, enriched by a dark, earthy musk. It seemed to cling to the walls, the carpeting, the very air filtration system of the 40th floor. It was a snare, and I was walking right into it. She began pulling me into her orbit with agonizing precision. Before, I was a tool she used to build her skyscrapers. Now, I was a fixture by her side. Maya, bring the structural reports, she would say over the intercom, her voice a low rumble. I would enter her office, and she wouldn't be behind her desk. She would be at the drafting table, sleeves rolled up, exposing lean forearms dusted with freckles. She would make me stand beside her, shoulder to shoulder, to review the blueprints. Look at the cantilever here, she murmured on Thursday afternoon, leaning over the table. Her shoulder brushed mine. The contact was electric, a jolt went straight down my spine, pulling low in my pelvis. I let out a sharp, involuntary breath. Eleanor paused. She didn't pull away. She turned her head, her nose inches from my ear. I could feel the heat of her breath against my jaw. She was inhaling slowly, deliberately. Your scent is changing, Eleanor noted, her voice a gravelly whisper. I gripped the edge of the drafting table, my knuckles turning white. It's the withdrawal from the blockers. No. Eleanor shifted, turning her body fully toward me. I was trapped between her and the table. It's not just withdrawal. It's sweetening. You smell like bruised apples and honey. My face burned. Omegas weren't supposed to smell like that in the office. We were supposed to smell like nothing neutral, professional. To have an alpha comment on my scent was entirely inappropriate. It was a violation of HR policy. But I didn't want to call HR. I wanted to lean into her. My biology, freed from its chemical cage, was recognizing its counterpart. It was screaming at me to submit, to let this massive, capable alpha take the reins. I hated it. I hated the weakness. I forced myself to take a step back, breaking the proximity. I need to get back to my desk, I said, grabbing my tablet. Eleanor watched me, her gray eyes dark and hooded. She didn't stop me. Go drink some water. You look flushed. By Friday, the physical symptoms of my impending heat began to bleed into my waking life. The air conditioning in the building felt like it was broken. A perpetual low-grade fever burned under my skin. My clothes felt restrictive, the fabric abrasive against my overly sensitive skin. I was at the copy machine in the break room, waiting for a massive stack of permits to print. I was leaning against the counter, my eyes closed, trying to breathe through a sudden, dizzying wave of heat that had rolled through my body. My lower back ached, a deep, rhythmic throbbing that meant my body was preparing. Not yet, I pleaded silently. It's only Friday. I have until Tuesday. Please. You're in pain. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. Eleanor was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard her approach. The thick carpeting masked her footsteps. But I should have smelled her. I was so consumed by my own internal fire, I had missed the approaching storm. "I'm fine," I lied, gripping the edge of the counter. "You're lying." Eleanor stepped closer. The break room was empty. The hum of the copier was the only sound. She reached out. I flinched, expecting her to grab my arm. Instead, her large, warm hand settled gently against the back of my neck. My knees actually buckled. If I hadn't been leaning against the counter, I would have hit the floor. The contact was devastating. Her thumb brushed over my scent gland, directly over the pulse point that was hammering like a trapped bird. A choked, pathetic little sound escaped my throat, a whimper. I slapped a hand over my mouth, utterly mortified. No. No, no, no. Eleanor's grip on my neck tightened, fractionally supportive, holding my weight. Her chest pressed against my back. She was completely enveloping me in her scent, in her heat. "Your temperature is through the roof, Maya," Eleanor murmured, her lips brushing against the shell of my ear. "Your cycle isn't waiting until Tuesday. It's coming early." "It can't," I choked out, tears of frustration pricking my eyes. I hated this. I hated being a slave to my glands. "I have deadlines." "Screw the deadlines." Eleanor's voice dropped to a growl that vibrated right through my ribcage. It was a territorial sound, an alpha sound. "Your body is reacting to the drop in hormones," and she trailed off, her thumbs stroking my nape. "And what?" I breathed, unable to move, unable to pull away from the heavy, anchoring weight of her hand. "And it's reacting to me," Eleanor said softly. "You know it is. My proximity is pushing you into heat." She was right. I knew she was right. Every time she looked at me, every time she stood too close, my body interpreted it as a biological trigger. The copier finished its run, beeping loudly. The spell broke. I tore myself away from her, stumbling a step forward. I grabbed the stack of papers, clutching them to my chest like a shield. My breathing was jagged. Eleanor stood there, her hand still suspended in the air for a fraction of a second before she lowered it into her pocket. She looked perfectly composed, but her eyes were black with blown-out pupils. "Pack up your desk," Eleanor ordered. The gentleness was gone, replaced by absolute, unyielding authority. "I'm having my driver take you home. You are done for the week." "Eleanor," I started, her name slipping out without the honorific. "Now, Maya." I didn't argue. I couldn't. I went to my desk, threw my laptop into my bag, and grabbed my coat. My limbs felt heavy, filled with lead. When I got to the elevator bank, Eleanor was waiting. She didn't say a word. We rode down in silence, the tension so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Outside, a sleek black town car was idling at the curb. The driver opened the back door. I hesitated. I looked back at Eleanor. She was standing under the awning of the building, the wind whipping her tie over her shoulder. She looked like a queen surveying her domain. "Go home, Maya," she said. "Lock your doors." "What about the Hawthorne project?" I asked, a desperate, final attempt to cling to my professional reality. Eleanor smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a predatory baring of teeth that sent a fresh wave of heat straight to my core. "I have your schedule," Eleanor said softly, the words carrying easily over the noise of the city street. "I know exactly where you'll be." I got into the car. The door shut, sealing me in. As the car pulled away, I leaned my burning forehead against the cool tinted glass. I looked back. Eleanor was still standing there, watching the car disappear into traffic. I had accidentally sent my alpha boss my heat schedule. And as the first agonizing cramp of my impending cycle twisted in my gut, I realized she wasn't going to fire me. She was going to hunt me. My apartment, usually a sterile sanctuary of gray upholstery and glass surfaces, felt like a pressure cooker. I made it inside, engaged the deadbolt, and slid the chain into place. My hands were slick with sweat, the metal of the lock slipping against my thumbs. I leaned my back against the heavy door and slid down to the hardwood floor. It started as a dull ache in my joints, radiating outward from my spine. Within an hour, it was a biological wildfire. I dragged myself to the thermostat and cranked the central air down to 60 degrees. It didn't matter. My internal temperature was skyrocketing. My skin felt tight, overly sensitive to the friction of my own clothes. I stripped off my blazer, fumbling with the buttons on my silk blouse in my haste to get it off. The fabric felt like sandpaper. I kicked off my shoes, leaving them in a pathetic heap in the entryway. Normally, heat cycles were manageable, a heavily medicated haze of mild discomfort, slept off over 3 days with a stockpile of generic suppressants and trash TV. But this was 5 years of suppressed biology crashing into me at terminal velocity. I stumbled into the bathroom. The fluorescent vanity light felt like a physical blow to my retinas. I braced my hands on the edge of the porcelain sink, panting, and stared at the mirror. I looked like a corpse that had been left in the sun. My skin was flushed a chaotic, mottled red. My pupils were entirely blown out, reducing my irises to thin rings of muddy hazel. And the smell, my apartment usually smelled faintly of bleach and drafting vellum. Now the air was thick, suffocatingly sweet. The bruised apple and honey scent Eleanor had noted was fully blooming, but underneath it was something darker, heavier, desperation. It was a chemical broadcast screaming into the void, begging for an anchor. I turned on the cold water and splashed it over my face, gasping at the shock. Get it together, Maya, I thought, my inner voice sounding thin and panicky. It's just a hormone spike. You are an adult with a mortgage. You have a 401k. I stumbled back into the living room, my legs feeling like wet concrete. My brain, hijacked by instinct, started issuing absurd commands. The leather sofa was too exposed. The bed was too far away. I needed a corner. I needed a barrier. I fought it. I literally stood in the center of my living room and argued with my own endocrine system. I am not building a nest, I growled to the empty room. I am not a damn pigeon. 20 minutes later, I was on my hands and knees, dragging my duvet, 3 sofa cushions, and a pile of unwashed laundry into the narrow space between my bookshelf and the wall. It was humiliating. Every time I tried to stop, a sharp, twisting cramp would seize my lower abdomen, doubling me over until I grabbed another soft item to add to the pile. I curled into the center of it, shivering violently despite the sweat pooling at my collarbone. I pulled a hoodie over my face, one that had accidentally brushed against Eleanor's coat in the office coat room months ago. It faintly, barely smelled of cedar. I buried my nose in the fabric, drawing a pathetic, ragged breath. The ghost of her scent provided a fraction of a second of relief before reality slammed back in. It was wrong. The scent was stale. I needed the ozone. I needed the static charge. Time lost its rigid structure. It stretched and warped. I drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, waking up to my own choked whimpers. The sun set, plunging the apartment into deep shadows. Around what felt like midnight, the ache shifted. It stopped being a generalized pain and became a localized, hollow throbbing deep in my chest and lower stomach. It was an agonizing emptiness. Then my breath caught. My nose twitched. The air intake vent above my makeshift nest rattled slightly, bleeding through the stale, recycled air of the apartment building a microscopic trace of something sharp, metal, lightning, crushed cedar. It was faint, filtered through layers of drywall and hallway carpeting, but my body recognized it instantly. A violent shudder ripped through me. The cramps paused, replaced by a terrifying, liquid heat. I dragged the hoodie away from my face, my chest heaving. She was here. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks echoed through the apartment. Not the frantic pounding of a concerned neighbor. Not the generic rapid tap of a delivery driver. It was a measured, commanding thud-thud-thud. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself deeper into the corner. Go away. Please, God, just go away. Maya. The voice was muffled by the thick wood of the door, but the low, resonant contralto vibrated straight through the floorboards and into my bones. I let out a shaky breath, biting down on my lower lip so hard I tasted copper. I couldn't ignore her. My brain said stay hidden. My biology was literally dragging me upright. I untangled myself from the duvet. My legs were trembling so violently I had to lean against the wall to stay upright. I stumbled down the short hallway, my bare feet slapping quietly against the hardwood. The scent of ozone was suffocating now, pooling thick and heavy under the crack of the front door. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood, closing my eyes. Miss Vance, I croaked, my voice a ruined, raspy wreck. You shouldn't be here. Open the door, Maya. There was no anger in her tone. Just absolute, terrifying certainty. I'm in isolation, I managed, gripping the doorknob but refusing to turn it. It's a liability issue. Company policy. I own the company, Eleanor replied smoothly. And I'm overriding policy. Open the door, or I will have the super unlock it. She's standing right next to me. My eyes snapped open. She wouldn't. I looked through the peephole. Eleanor was standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. She had ditched the suit jacket and tie. Her white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up. She held a brown paper pharmacy bag in one hand. And true to her word, Mrs. Henderson, my terrified-looking building superintendent, was hovering nervously a few feet away, clutching her master keyring. A flush of profound humiliation burned through the fever. She was making a spectacle of me. Fine, I hissed. I undid the deadbolt with a loud clack, but I kept the chain on. I opened the door exactly 3 inches. Eleanor's face appeared in the gap. Up close, the gray of her eyes was almost entirely swallowed by the dilated pitch-black pupils of a triggered alpha. The scent rolling off her hit me like a physical punch to the gut, pure, unfiltered dominance. My knees buckled slightly, and I had to grip the edge of the door to keep from falling. Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor said, not taking her eyes off mine. You can leave us. Yes, ma'am. Have a good evening, Miss Vance. The super squeaked, practically running down the hall. Silence descended, heavy and fraught. Eleanor looked at me through the crack. Her gaze dropped from my sweat-slicked hair to my flushed face, down to the ragged collar of my T-shirt where my collarbones were visibly trembling. You look exactly like I knew you would, Eleanor murmured, her voice dropping to a gravelly register that made my toes curl into the floorboards. Take the chain off. Eleanor, please, I whispered. My cynical edge was gone, melted down by the fever. If you come in here, I don't know what I'll do. I have no blockers left in my system. I know. She held up the pharmacy bag. I brought you electrolytes and a microdose of a beta blocker, just enough to stop the physical cramping, but not enough to stall the cycle. Your liver needs a break. She wasn't here to take advantage of a drugged omega. She was here to manage me, to care for me. And somehow, that was infinitely more dangerous. My shaking fingers reached for the chain. It rattled against the metal track. I hesitated. Maya. Eleanor's voice was softer now, a command wrapped in velvet. Let me in. I slid the chain free. Eleanor pushed the door open. She stepped over the threshold, her large frame instantly shrinking the size of my entryway. She kicked the door shut behind her with the heel of her shoe. The lock clicked into place, sealing us in. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. The frantic, sour panic of my scent was immediately swallowed up by her heavy, grounding cedar. My lungs, which had been fighting for shallow breaths all evening, suddenly expanded. I took a deep, dragging inhale. It was relief. Immediate, intoxicating relief. I swayed forward, entirely against my own volition. Eleanor dropped the bag onto the console table and caught me before I could hit the floor. Her large, warm hands gripped my upper arms, holding me steady. The heat radiating off her was incredible, but it didn't burn like my fever. It was a deep, anchoring warmth. She rumbled. I sagged against her chest, burying my face into her shoulder. I knew I was ruining my career. I knew I was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But the fabric of her shirt smelled so intensely of her, and the solid wall of her chest against mine felt like the only real thing in the world. "You're burning up," Eleanor noted, shifting her grip. One arm wrapped entirely around my waist, pulling my hips flush against hers. I let out a sharp, pathetic gasp at the friction. Her other hand moved up, her cool palm coming to rest against my forehead. The contrast was heaven. I leaned into her touch, a low, humiliating purr beginning to vibrate in the back of my throat. I tried to swallow it down, horrified by the sound, but I couldn't stop it. Eleanor's hand slid from my forehead, her long fingers trailing down my flushed cheek, tracing the line of my jaw. She tilted my head back, forcing me to look up at her. "Look at you," she breathed, her thumb brushing over my trembling lower lip. "Trying so hard to be professional while you're literally vibrating out of your skin." "I hate you," I choked out, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of my dignity. Eleanor smiled. It was a dark, possessive curve of her lips. She leaned down, her nose brushing against the crook of my neck, right over my scent gland. I froze, my heart stopping entirely. She inhaled deeply, the sound loud in the quiet apartment. "No, you don't," Eleanor whispered against my skin, her breath sending violent shivers down my spine. "You're building a nest in your living room, Maya. And you're hoping I'm going to fill it." She pressed a slow, deliberate kiss against my pounding pulse point. "Show me where it is." My living room looked like the aftermath of a robbery as Eleanor guided me down the short hallway, her arm a solid iron bar around my waist. The shame began to burn through the fog of my fever. I tried to drag my feet to stall our momentum, but she just absorbed my dead weight and kept moving. We rounded the corner. The streetlights from the window cut through the dark apartment, illuminating the pathetic pile of bedding, sofa cushions, and dirty laundry wedged between the bookshelf and the wall. It wasn't a nest. It was a cry for help, constructed out of polyblend fabrics and desperation. "Don't look at it," I mumbled, trying to turn my face into her shoulder. The fabric of her shirt was damp with my sweat. I was ruining her clothes. I was ruining my life. "It's embarrassing." Eleanor stopped at the edge of the pile. She didn't laugh. She didn't offer a condescending, placating coo. She looked at the frantic arrangement of pillows and the hoodie I had dragged into the center with an expression of quiet, heavy reverence. "It's perfect," she said, her voice stripped of its usual corporate polish. It was rough, scraping against the silence of the room. She lowered me down. My knees folded immediately, and I sank into the duvet, the familiar, stale scent of my own distress rising up around me. But now it was immediately chased by the heavy, rolling thunder of Eleanor's ozone. She didn't hover over me. She sat down right in the middle of it. Eleanor Vance, a woman who owned half the commercial real estate skyline in the city, folded her long legs and settled onto a pile of my unwashed gym shirts and a cheap throw blanket. The visual was so jarring, so completely disjointed from my reality, that a short, broken laugh punched out of my chest. It sounded like a sob. "Drink," Eleanor commanded gently. I hadn't even noticed she'd brought the pharmacy bag with her. She cracked the seal on a bottle of electrolyte water, the plastic snapped sharply, and held it to my lips. My hands were shaking too badly to hold it, so I let her tip it back. The liquid was aggressively cold, tasting artificially of lemon and salt. I choked on the first swallow, coughing violently. Eleanor's large hand immediately went to the back of my neck, her thumb massaging the tense cords of muscle at the base of my skull. "Slow down." Breathe, Maya. She pressed a tiny white pill against my lips. Open. I opened my mouth, letting her slip the beta blocker onto my tongue. She tipped the water bottle up again. I swallowed, the bitter chalkiness lingering in the back of my throat. Give it 10 minutes, Eleanor said, setting the bottle aside. It will stop the muscle spasms. It won't stop the heat. I slumped back against a sofa cushion, pulling my knees to my chest. I felt exposed, stripped raw. Why did you bring that? I asked, my voice a raspy whisper. Alphas, they usually want an omega fully out of their mind. It makes them more compliant. Eleanor's jaw tightened. A flash of genuine anger darkened her pale eyes, the blown-out pupils expanding until the iris was completely swallowed. I don't want compliance, Maya, she said, her tone dangerously soft. I employ a building full of compliant people. They bore the hell out of me. She shifted closer. The mattress pad I had dragged onto the floor dipped under her weight. I want the woman who argues with me over the structural integrity of steel beams. I want the architect who glares at me when I reject her drafts. Eleanor murmured, reaching out. Her knuckles brushed against my damp cheek. I want you awake for this. The words hit me like a physical blow. The last 5 years of my life had been dedicated to erasing my biology so I could be seen for my mind. I had starved myself of comfort, poisoned my liver with suppressants, all to prove I wasn't just a collection of instincts. And here was Eleanor, the apex of my professional anxiety, telling me she saw both, and she wanted both. A profound, terrifying crack echoed through my internal defenses. I felt like a load-bearing column finally giving way under a stress it was never designed to hold. The beta blocker began to work. The sharp, stabbing cramps in my lower abdomen dulled into a heavy, pooling ache. But as the pain retreated, the sheer, unadulterated need rushed in to fill the vacuum. My body felt impossibly heavy, yet my skin buzzed with static electricity. Every breath I took was saturated with her, the crushed cedar intoxicating, grounding my frantic heartbeat, while the sharp ozone sparked deep, liquid heat between my thighs. Eleanor, I breathed. Her name tasted foreign and necessary on my tongue. I didn't think about it. I couldn't. I uncoiled my legs and dragged myself across the few inches of duvet separating us. I crawled into her lap. Eleanor let out a harsh, ragged sound, something between a groan and a growl. Her arms banded around me, crushing me against her chest. One hand buried itself in my damp hair, the other gripped my thigh, her long fingers digging into the muscle. I buried my face in the crook of her neck. The scent was strongest here, right over her own pulse point. I opened my mouth and dragged my teeth lightly against her collarbone through the fabric of her shirt. Eleanor shuddered. The immovable alpha actually shuddered. Maya, she rasped, her breath hot against my ear. If you do that again, I am going to tear the shirt off. And I am not going to be gentle. I closed my eyes. The cynicism, the fear, the carefully constructed walls of my corporate persona, they all burned away, leaving nothing but raw, perfect instinct. Then tear it off, I whispered. The sound of the cotton tearing was deafening in the quiet room. Eleanor didn't bother with the buttons. She gripped the lapels of her ruined dress shirt and pulled outward. The fabric gave way with a sharp rip, buttons pinging against the hardwood floor beyond the borders of my nest. She shrugged the ruined garment off, tossing it blindly into the shadows. The heat radiating from her bare skin was a furnace. I flattened my palms against her chest. Her musculature was dense, carved out of stone, her skin dusted with freckles that felt slightly rough beneath my sensitive fingertips. I could feel the frantic, heavy thud of her heart. It matched mine, beat for beat. I pushed myself up, straddling her thighs. The friction of my jeans against her slacks sent a jolt of pure white lightning straight to my core. I gasped, throwing my head back. Eleanor took advantage of the exposure. Instantly, her mouth descended on my neck. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was an open-mouthed, wet, desperate claiming. Her teeth scraped against my collarbone, dragging upward toward the highly sensitive skin of my scent gland. I cried out, my hands instinctively flying up to grip her shoulders. My nails dug half-moons into her skin. She was scenting me deeply. Her tongue swept over the pulse point at my jaw, tasting the heavy, honeyed sweat that coated my skin. She was overriding the stale smell of my apartment, overriding the chemical residue of the suppressants, drowning me in cedar and static, painting my skin with her claim before she even broke the surface. Bruised apples, Eleanor growled against my throat, her voice vibrating right against my vocal cords. God, you are so sweet underneath all that armor. It's just biology, I stammered, a final, pathetic attempt at rational thought. My brain was desperately trying to tread water in a sea of hormones. It's just the heat. Eleanor pulled back. Her eyes were entirely black now, the iris is gone. The professional facade was completely dead. She looked feral. She looked hungry. Shut up, she commanded, her hands dropping to my hips, her grip bruising. Stop analyzing it. Stop fighting me. She rolled her hips upward, pressing the hard, heavy ridge of her arousal directly against my center. A choked, humiliating whine ripped out of my throat. My spine bowed. The hollow ache inside me flared into an agonizing void. I needed weight. I needed pressure. I needed her to anchor me before I floated away completely. I leaned down, crushing my mouth against hers. The kiss was a collision, messy, all teeth and bruising pressure. She tasted like black coffee and power. I opened my mouth for her completely, letting her tongue sweep inside, taking whatever she wanted. The taste of her was a sedative and a stimulant all at once. My hands tangled in her dark hair, pulling her closer, closer, until I couldn't tell where my fever ended and her heat began. Eleanor's hands moved frantically over my body. She gripped the hem of my t-shirt and yanked it over my head in one fluid motion, tossing it aside. The cold air of the apartment hit my sweat-slick skin, but I barely registered it before she was pulling me flush against her bare chest. Skin to skin. A heavy, rolling purr erupted from my chest. I couldn't stop it. The vibration rattled against Eleanor's sternum. She broke the kiss, dragging her mouth down my jawline. She was panting, her breath hot and ragged. There it is, she murmured, her hands tracing the line of my spine, pressing me tighter against her. There's my omega. The word should have disgusted me. It should have sent me running for the door. But hearing it from her, in this nest, bathed in her scent, it felt like the click of a deadbolt sliding perfectly into place. Eleanor pushed me backward. I fell onto the pile of pillows, gasping as the air was knocked out of me. She followed me down immediately, settling her heavy frame over mine. She caged me in, her knees boxing my hips, her forearms planted on either side of my head. She stared down at me. The sheer, terrifying weight of her attention was almost too much to bear. You sent me your schedule, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a gravelly register that made my vision blur. It was an accident, I breathed, my chest heaving, my bare skin flushed a deep feverish red. I don't care. Eleanor lowered her head, her lips hovering an inch above my scent gland. The skin there was practically vibrating, engorged and hypersensitive. You gave me the map, Maya. And I am taking the territory. Eleanor, I whimpered. My hands fluttered up, burying themselves in her hair. I wasn't pushing her away. I was holding her there. Say it, she demanded, her breath ghosting over the gland. The proximity was a physical agony. Tell me you want this. Tell me to take it. My cynical, practical mind screamed one final protest. She's your boss. This is career suicide. You are losing yourself. But the alpha above me let out a low, rumbling growl of absolute need, and the protest burned to ash. Take it, I sobbed, arching my neck to offer her the perfect angle. Please, Eleanor. Mark me. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She opened her mouth, her jaw unhinging slightly, and buried her face in my neck. I felt the blunt pressure of her teeth, the wet slide of her tongue, and then the sharp, exquisite pain of her canines breaking the skin. The initial puncture wasn't romantic. It was a violent, blinding shock. Eleanor's canines broke the fragile skin over my scent gland with the brutal efficiency of a predator. A sharp, white-hot line of agony flared up the side of my neck, so intense my vision completely whitened out for a fraction of a second. I screamed. It wasn't a sexy, breathless sound. It was a raw, tearing noise of pure animal panic. My hands, which had been holding her, instantly turned into claws. I dug my nails into her shoulders, thrashing blindly, my rational brain screaming that I was dying, that my throat was being ripped out. But Eleanor was a mountain falling on top of me. She absorbed my thrashing without shifting an inch. One of her massive hands slid up to the crown of my head, holding me firmly in place against the pillows, while her heavy hips pinned my legs down. She didn't let up. She bit deeper. Then the venom hit. It didn't feel like a chemical. It felt like a physical wave of liquid gold pouring directly into my bloodstream, rushing out from the bite and flooding my chest. The agonizing pain warped, twisting instantly into a profound, suffocating euphoria. My spine went completely slack. The fight died in my muscles, my hands falling limply from her shoulders to rest against her damp back. A heavy, wet sob tore out of my throat, but it was a sound of absolute surrender. Eleanor's scent changed the second her venom mixed with my blood. The sharp, warning crack of ozone vanished, replaced by an overpowering, suffocating blanket of crushed cedar and dark, rich earth. It was the scent of a locked vault. It was possession. She pulled back, her chest heaving. Her mouth was slick with saliva and a smear of my blood. Her pale gray eyes were completely gone, nothing but blown out, bottomless black wells of instinct. She looked down at my neck, at the deep, bleeding crescent moon she had just carved into my flesh, and a low, terrifyingly satisfied rumble vibrated in her chest. Mine, she breathed. The word wasn't a sweet nothing. It was a gavel coming down. Yours, I whimpered back. I couldn't have lied if I wanted to. The bond was already wrapping around my brain, silencing 5 years of cynical independence in less than 5 seconds. She didn't give me time to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what I had just done. The heat had reached its absolute zenith, fueled by the fresh, raw bond. Eleanor dragged my sweat-soaked jeans down my hips, her hands rough and entirely devoid of the careful corporate restraint she exercised in the office. I kicked the denim away, leaving myself completely bare in the center of that pathetic pile of cushions and dirty laundry. I didn't care. The shame was gone. What followed wasn't gentle lovemaking. It was a biological necessity, executed with frantic, messy desperation. When she finally pushed inside me, the stretch and the fullness were so overwhelming I saw stars. I arched off the floor, a broken cry shattering the quiet of the apartment. Eleanor caught my hips, her fingers bruising the soft flesh of my thighs, anchoring me to the earth as she began to move. The friction was agonizingly good. It was loud skin slapping against skin, the harsh, ragged sound of our breathing, the muffled thud of the mattress pad against the hardwood floor. I tasted copper from biting my own lip. I tasted the salt of her sweat when she leaned down to crush her mouth against mine. Every thrust drove the bond deeper. I felt the exact moment her control snapped. Her rhythm turned jagged, punishing. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, right over the raw, bleeding mark, her chest hitching with a final, guttural shout that rattled against my collarbone. She flooded me. The knot at the base of her anatomy swelled, locking us together with a brutal, unavoidable finality. I shattered around her. The climax ripped through me like a physical earthquake, my muscles locking up, my toes curling so hard they cramped. I sobbed openly into the dark room, tears of overwhelming relief and absolute terror streaking through the sweat on my face. We lay there in the wreckage of my living room, locked together, completely immobilized by our own biology. The silence of the apartment slowly crept back in, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged sound of Eleanor trying to catch her breath against my neck. I was tethered to her, physically, chemically, permanently. I closed my eyes. The heavy narcotic of the alpha's bite pulled me under into a deep, dreamless void. For the first time in 5 years, the spreadsheet in my head was completely blank. The light woke me. It wasn't the soft, forgiving light of dawn. It was the harsh, aggressive glare of a Sunday afternoon bleeding through the gaps in my cheap plastic blinds. I tried to turn over, and my body instantly screamed in protest. My lower back ached with a deep, hollow soreness. My hips felt bruised. But worse than the physical ache was the immediate, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. An arm, the size of a steel girder, was wrapped securely around my waist, pinning my back firmly against a broad, impossibly hot chest. Reality crashed down on me. Completely. Devoid of the feverish haze that had protected me the night before. The heat was over. The biological storm had passed. I was lying naked on a pile of sofa cushions with the CEO of Vance Associates. I stopped breathing. My eyes darted around the room. The apartment looked like a crime scene. Ripped clothing was scattered across the floor. The pharmacy bag lay crushed near the doorway. The air was thick, heavy, and stale, a claustrophobic cocktail of sex, sweat, bruised apples, and a terrifyingly dominant cedar. Slowly, terrifyingly, my hand crept up to the side of my neck. My fingers brushed against raised, swollen flesh. Too deep, scabbed indentations right over my scent gland. It wasn't a fever dream. It was a permanent, undeniable physical contract. A cold spike of panic, pure, cynical, corporate panic, drove a wedge through the lingering warmth of the bond. What had I done? I was ruined. HR would have a field day. The board of directors would crucify us both. She would have to fire me to save face. Or worse, keep me on as some sort of glorified, bonded pet in the drafting room. My breathing hitched, growing shallow and rapid. My scent spiked, souring instantly with distress. The arm around my waist tightened like a vice. Stop thinking. A gravelly voice rumbled directly into my ear. I flinched. Eleanor shifted behind me, her heavy chest rubbing against my bare spine. She hadn't been asleep. She had just been lying there, waiting for my brain to catch up to my body. Eleanor, I croaked, my throat feeling like it was lined with broken glass. Miss Vance, oui. What, Maya? Eleanor asked. She didn't sound panicked. She sounded infuriatingly calm. She buried her nose into my hair, inhaling deeply. We bonded. You went into heat. I claimed you. It's a disaster, I whispered, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. I tried to pull away, to sit up, but she just clamped down harder, refusing to yield an inch. The firm, the conflict of interest, the HR protocols. You're the senior partner. I'm just a junior architect. Eleanor let out a harsh, dismissive breath. She reached up, her large hand wrapping around my throat. She didn't squeeze, but her thumb deliberately brushed over the raw, tender bite mark. A jolt of pure electricity shot down my spine. The panic instantly short-circuited, overridden by the brutal authority of the alpha who had marked me. My shoulders slumped. Do you think I give a single damn about HR protocols? Eleanor said, her voice cold and flat. I built that firm. I own the building. I write the policies. They'll talk, I argued miserably, staring at a stain on my hardwood floor. They'll say I slept my way up. They'll look at my blueprints and see your teeth in my neck. Eleanor shifted, rolling us both over so she was hovering above me. The light from the window illuminated her face. She looked entirely different. The immaculate, untouchable CEO was gone. She was unshaven, her hair a mess, dark circles under her pale gray eyes. But she looked completely, terrifyingly grounded. She stared down at me, her gaze stripping away the last remnants of my corporate armor. "Let them talk," Eleanor stated simply. "You are an exceptional architect, Maya. You are also my Omega. Those two facts are not mutually exclusive. I am not hiding this. And I am certainly not hiding you." I swallowed hard, tears of sheer exhaustion pricking my eyes. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a subordinate and a mate. The power dynamic, it's a mess. "It is a mess," Eleanor agreed, her tone softening a fraction. She lowered her head, resting her forehead against mine. The contact was shockingly intimate. "We will figure it out. You will argue with me over load-bearing walls in the boardroom. And you will submit to me in my bed. We will draw the lines together." She pressed a firm, lingering kiss against the corner of my mouth. Then she pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. The black pupils had receded, but the gray irises were like steel. "But understand this," Eleanor murmured. "You are not resigning. You are taking the rest of the week off to recover. And on Monday, you are coming back to the office. And you are taking the desk inside my office." My cynical brain wanted to argue. It wanted to scream about optics and professionalism and independence. But as I lay there, surrounded by the wreckage of my heat, breathing in the heavy, protective scent of her cedar, the fight just drained out of me. The exhausting, 5-year war I had waged against my own biology was over. I had lost. And looking up at the ruthless, immovable alpha who was currently sitting on a pile of my dirty laundry, I realized I didn't care. "Monday," I whispered back, my voice barely holding together. "Inside your office." Eleanor smiled. It wasn't the predatory baring of teeth from outside the building. It was a genuine, possessive curve of her lips. "Good girl," she rumbled. She leaned down to claim my mouth again. And for the first time in my life, I didn't calculate the risks. I just closed my eyes and let the architecture of my old life collapse entirely. That is how Maya's meticulously structured corporate life crumbled, only to be rebuilt into something far more raw, intense, and permanent. The dynamic between an alpha boss and a bonded Omega employee is never going to be simple. But the tension in that corner office is going to be explosive. Extra story. The desk inside Eleanor Vance's office was absurd. It was a modernist slab of polished obsidian, easily 6 feet wide, positioned at a perfect right angle to her own massive desk. The chair was ergonomic, leather, and entirely too comfortable for someone who was supposed to be working. I'd been sitting in it for exactly 3 hours, and I still hadn't figured out where to put my feet. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, staring at the hawthorn blueprints spread across the obsidian surface. "You said that 20 minutes ago." Eleanor didn't look up from her own paperwork. She was wearing reading glasses, thin silver frames that made her look less like a corporate tyrant and more like a stern librarian. It was unfairly attractive. "You also said it yesterday. And the day before that. Because it remains true." I gestured vaguely at the massive glass wall separating us from the rest of the 40th floor. Everyone could see me. Every junior architect, every intern, every visiting client who walked through those frosted doors could see me sitting in my boss's office, like some kind of decorative houseplant. People are staring. Let them stare. Eleanor finally looked up, those pale gray eyes fixing on me with an intensity that still made my stomach flip. "You're not a houseplant, Maya. You're the best architect in this building. If anyone has a problem with where you sit, they can take it up with me. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" I opened my mouth, closed it, and realized I didn't actually have an answer. The point was that everything felt wrong. Wrong and terrifying, and also somehow exactly right, which was the most confusing part. I had spent 5 years carefully constructing a professional identity that had absolutely nothing to do with being an Omega. And now I was sitting 3 feet away from the alpha who had bitten me, wearing a high-necked blouse to hide the still tender mark on my throat, and trying very hard not to think about what had happened in my apartment 48 hours ago. Eleanor watched me struggle for a moment, then set down her pen. She removed her glasses, folding them slowly, deliberately. The gesture was so calm, so controlled, that it made me want to throw something. "Come here," she said. "What?" "Come here, Maya." I didn't move. My body, however, had other ideas. The bond, that stupid, traitorous, newly formed connection between us, pulsed warmly in my chest, urging me forward. I gripped the arms of my chair and held on. "I'm working. You're spiraling." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, completely relaxed, entirely immovable. "Come here, or I'll come over there. Your choice." She would. I knew she would. She'd walk across this absurdly large office, pull me out of my chair, and do something that would make my face burn for the rest of the afternoon. The woman had no sense of professional boundaries anymore. Or rather, she had decided that professional boundaries no longer applied to us. I pushed my chair back and walked around the obsidian desk. My legs felt unsteady, but I made it to her side without falling. Eleanor reached out and caught my wrist, her fingers warm and sure against my skin. She tugged gently, and I found myself perched on the edge of her desk, my knees brushing against her chair. "Look at me," she said. I did. It was harder than it should have been. Her eyes were so pale, so sharp, like she could see right through every defense I'd ever built. "Tell me what's wrong." "Everything's wrong." The words came out in a rush, barely controlled. "I sit in your office now. Everyone knows. The rumor started yesterday afternoon. I heard 2 interns talking about it in the break room. They said I was your personal project. Someone else said I'd earned my promotion in a very creative way. I can't," I broke off, my voice cracking. "I can't be the woman who slept her way to the top. That's not who I am." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her grip on my wrist tightened. Just slightly. Just enough to remind me that she was still there, still listening. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "I've known for 3 years, Maya. I've watched you stay late, come in early, redo entire presentations because you found a single decimal point out of place. You didn't get this promotion because you slept with me. You got it because you're brilliant and stubborn, and you argue with me about structural integrity like you actually think you might win. I might win someday. Unlikely." The corner of her mouth twitched. "But I appreciate the effort." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I ended up doing neither, just sitting there on the edge of her desk, breathing in the familiar scent of ozone and cedar that had become so inextricably linked to her. "People will always talk," Eleanor continued, her thumb tracing slow circles on my wrist. "They talked when I took over this firm at 32. They talked when I fired half the senior partners for embezzlement. They talk because they have nothing better to do. And you, Maya," she reached up with her free hand, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You are going to prove them wrong. You're going to design buildings that make them forget their own names. And you're going to do it while sitting in that ridiculously expensive chair I bought for you. It is ridiculously expensive. I know. I picked it out myself." I let out a shaky breath. The panic was still there, coiled tight in my chest, but it was quieter now. Eleanor had a way of doing that, of making the impossible seem manageable, of making me believe that I could actually survive this. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "The night you came to my apartment." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "You could have just fired me. You could have pretended the email never happened and moved me to a different floor. Why didn't you?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I've been watching you for years, Maya. Not because you're an omega. Because you're exceptional. And every day, I watched you destroy yourself trying to hide a part of who you are. Those pills you were taking, they were going to kill you eventually. Your liver, your heart, your endocrine system, You were sacrificing all of it for a job that would replace you in a week if you dropped dead. That's not. It is. She cut me off gently. I've seen it happen. Brilliant omegas who work themselves into the ground because they're terrified of being seen as weak. And I couldn't, she paused, her jaw tightening. I couldn't watch you do the same thing. I stared at her. The ruthless CEO, the woman who had built an empire from nothing, who had never shown a single moment of vulnerability in 3 years of working together. She looked almost hesitant, almost uncertain. Eleanor, I said slowly, do you actually care about me? Or is this just the bond? She finished the sentence for me, something dark flickering in her eyes. You think I marked you because of biology? I don't know what to think. Eleanor stood up. She was taller than me, always had been, but standing this close, with her body barely an inch away from mine, the height difference felt enormous. She reached up and cupped my face, her palm warm against my cheek. I wanted you long before you sent that email, she said. I wanted you the first time you argued with me about the Hawthorne load-bearing calculations. I wanted you when you nearly set the break room on fire trying to microwave a burrito. I wanted you when you showed up to a client meeting with coffee spilled all over your blouse and still delivered a presentation that made everyone in the room forget their own names. My breath caught. That was months ago. I know. Eleanor's thumb brushed over my lower lip, featherlight. I waited, Maya. I was going to keep waiting. I was going to let you figure out your own life, your own choices, without me interfering. And then you sent me your schedule, and I realized I didn't have to wait anymore. You're saying you would have, I couldn't finish the sentence. I'm saying the bond isn't the reason I want you. It's just the reason I finally stopped pretending I didn't. I didn't know what to say to that. So I did the only thing that made sense. I leaned forward and kissed her. It was different from the heat-fueled desperation of the other night. Slower. Deliberate. Eleanor's hands slid into my hair, tilting my head back, and she kissed me like she had all the time in the world. Like we weren't standing in her office in the middle of a workday, with half the building probably watching through the glass walls. I have a meeting in 20 minutes, she murmured against my lips. Then you should let me go. I should. She didn't let go. But I don't want to. I laughed, a real laugh, the first one I'd managed since this whole disaster started. You're impossible. You're the one who kissed me. You kissed me first. I kissed you first. Eleanor smiled, and it transformed her face completely, made her look younger, softer, almost human. Are you going to hold that against me? Maybe. In that case, I'll just have to try harder. She kissed me again, and I let myself fall into it. The panic was still there, buried somewhere deep, but it was manageable now. Because Eleanor was right, people would talk, rumors would spread, and none of it mattered. I was still the same architect I'd always been. I just happened to have an alpha boss who also happened to be the most infuriating, impossible, wonderful woman I'd ever met. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were dark, her breathing slightly uneven. You should go back to your desk, she said. Before I decide to cancel that meeting, what would you tell the client? That my architect was being difficult. She smoothed down my collar, her fingers lingering on the fabric. Which would be true. Difficult. I raised an eyebrow. I haven't even started arguing with you yet. There's always after the meeting. I slid off the desk, my legs steadier than they'd been all morning. I'll hold you to that. I hope you do. I walked back to my absurdly expensive chair and sat down, pulling the Hawthorne blueprints toward me. The room felt different now, warmer, more alive. Outside the glass walls, the rest of the 40th floor carried on, oblivious to the fact that their CEO had just kissed her junior architect in the middle of a workday. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I just felt like me. The meeting ended at 4. Eleanor walked back into the office, loosening her tie, and I looked up from the blueprints to find her watching me. You were right, she said. About what? About the cantilever. She dropped into her chair, looking almost annoyed. The client's consultant agreed with you. We're going to have to reinforce the eastern wing. I smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won an argument against a woman who never lost. I told you. You did. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but there was no real heat in it. And now I have to redo half the budget. That sounds like a you problem. It sounds like a you problem, since you'll be the one recalculating the load-bearing estimates. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. Because she was looking at me with that expression again, the one that made my stomach flip and my heart race. You're impossible, I said. I know. She leaned back in her chair, the picture of casual confidence. But you love it. I didn't deny it. And somewhere, deep in the bond that connected us, I felt her satisfaction ripple through me like warm water. Fine, I said, picking up my pen. I'll recalculate the estimates. But you're buying dinner. Deal. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since I'd sent that disastrous email, everything felt like it was going to be okay. The end.